All right, so today I'm going to be covering the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. I actually wanted to change things up a little bit for this year. So last year, I would take 2 weeks for an opening. I would, you know, cover an opening, introduce it, give you some games to go over, and then I would set up some puzzles related to that opening for the next week. So this year, I actually want to do a little bit differently. I want to cover some games that I selected for the opening and just do one opening per week instead of doing the puzzles this time. So that'll let us do more specific variations instead of a general opening, system. So I think I hope that'll be more helpful. Um, so I picked a dragon. One because I think Lucas wanted to see this, and uh,
Okay.
also this isn't just useful if you play the dragon as black. For example, if you play the English, 1c4 is white. Uh, it's really useful too. There's a lot of ideas that you can transfer to that opening too. Uh, and there's a lot of instructive ideas on the dragon too. So if you play the Najdorf, for example, the sacrifice on c3 and some others will be useful to you. So I want to start off actually by showing a game where black gets crushed, and it's by Fischer. And this game kind of put the dragon out of fashion for a long time until some English players began bringing it back into popularity. By English, I mean actually, players who are from England, not 1c4 players. Um, so this game, first game I want to go over is between Fischer and Larson. Now, if you have his book, Fischer wrote a book called My 60 Memorable Games. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. He gives a lot of cool analyses. It's not going to be over your head. I think it's pretty much suitable for all of you here. It's a great book, and he goes over this game in that book.
Slaying the dragon.
Yeah, and he makes it seem like the dragon's basically just refuted and unplayable and everything. Turns out that's not true, luckily. But first, let's see what happened. So the dragon starts off with black playing d6, and if you haven't seen the Sicilian so far, by the way, the whole point of this opening is to control the center from the side, and if white wants to open up the game, he'll have to give up a center pawn for a side pawn. So it creates an imbalance just right off the bat. So generally speaking, if you want a complicated game, the Sicilian as black is one of your best options. So white in playing d4 and knight takes d4, this is called the open Sicilian. And then black plays knight f6, and then g6. You don't necessarily have to play knight f6 first. You can play other variations of the dragon. In fact, you don't even have to play d6. But one advantage of playing knight f6 before g6 or before knight c6 is that you force white's knight to come out to c3, and so you prevent a popular possible white idea where white could play c4 and then play knight c3, and black's not lost in those positions, and that pawn structure, by the way, is known as a Maroczy bind. But generally speaking, you wouldn't really want to allow that because it gives white a more stable position. He can build on his advantage from there. So one nice thing about black's move order here is that you prevent that. All right. And now g6. Now, I've heard various stories why it's called a dragon. I've heard most convincing theory I've heard is that there's a constellation which has a dragon name or something like that, where the pawn structure, if you include the pawn on c5, it looks like that constellation. Now, I don't know if that's true or not or whatever, but anyway, I like the name. I mean, what cooler opening could you ask to play, right? So there's lots of options, but really the most critical line if you play a dragon is this thing called the Yugoslavia Tack. And there are other variations which I could get into, but those are less relevant, really. This is the scariest one because it's the one where you're most likely to get checkmated on move 20. Okay. So white's idea with bishop e3, which you'll see in a minute, is to try to exchange off your dark squared bishop. That's one of the basic ideas. Now bishop g7. Now if you like bishops like I do, you might be immediately tempted to pursue it with this move knight g4. Yeah, but knight g4 is bad here. Would anyone like to tell me why? What was it?
The queen.
The queen?
But the knight protected by the bishop.
Yeah, so unfortunately, that bishop protects it, so queen takes doesn't quite work. Well, okay.
Typically loses a pawn after bishop b5.
Mm-hmm. So bishop b5 is a big problem for black because bishop d7, knight d7 would obviously lose the knight then. So bishop d7 seems logical, but yeah. White can just take it anyway. Because the bishop's pinned, the queen is not actually attacked by the bishop. So white just won a piece. And black hardly has much better. Knight c6 is probably forced, but after knight takes and bishop takes, white's going to win a pawn in the exchange, and that's enough for a decisive advantage. So knight g4 right away isn't good, so just keep developing with bishop g7. Now we see white playing f3, so you might wonder, if knight g4 wasn't a threat, why would white bother playing f3? You might think, given white's later moves, you might wonder why not just queen d2 right away. But now it doesn't work because after knight g4, the queen's not attacking the knight. So after bishop b5, bishop d7 is perfectly fine. All right. So white plays f3 before queen d2 to make sure that knight can't go in on g4 and harass the bishop. Okay. So now castles. By the way, you can interpose castles in knight c6. They're pretty equivalent. So now queen d2 and knight c6. And now kind of a move order thing. So white plays bishop c4 here. Now white's plan when you play the Yugoslavia Attack is to castle queenside. So the kings will be on opposite sides. So you might wonder, why shouldn't white just castle right away then? I'm not going to get into it today, but it allows black to play this d5 move. And the game is still complicated, but white doesn't have the same attacking possibilities that he does with bishop c4. Black's made this break in the center and gets some control there. So bishop c4 is the most critical, complicated move. Okay. Castle's queenside is fine for white. It's more positional, but bishop c4 is really the critical idea. So now Larson plays his knight takes d4 move, and this is perfectly fine. But I think this is not what you should play as black. I'll have a bunch of other games and recommendations for you later. Basically, the problem with taking on d4 is black loses a piece that can bother white on the queen side. In fact, as you'll see later, a lot of times that knight will exchange itself for white's I-squared bishop, which is an important attacking piece. So that's one reason why you might not want to take. But it is playable. So now bishop b6. Now black can't tolerate that bishop on c4 forever. I said b3 because white played bishop b3. So black should try to exchange it if you can. So now we have kings castled on opposite wings. Now, when kings are on the same side of the board, usually you concentrate more on improving your control over the center, or maybe launching a wing attack to make a weakness. But when kings are on opposite sides of the board, a lot of times it comes down to both sides, flinging their pawns and pieces on the other side of the board to try to attack. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that idea before, but in the Dragon, it's pretty classic. So b5. So black begins the pawn storm. Now king b1. King b1 is useful so that black doesn't have this idea of taking on b3 and coming down to a1 with the queen. All right, king b1 is almost always useful in the Dragon for white, so you'll see it a lot. And now black plays this b4 move. b4 turns out is okay. Although for what it's worth, I'm not sure if everyone here has heard of him, but Hikaru Nakamura is one of the top US players, and he played this position recently with black, and he tried rook fc8. And that's probably black's best if you're going to play this line for black. But b4 is probably still fine. Now knight d5. And here's where Larson made a huge mistake, actually. He definitely should have just played knight takes d5 here. Gotten rid of that white bishop. That white bishop's just so powerful. The reason he didn't play knight takes d5 is because after bishop g7, king takes, e takes, black has his backwards pawn at e7, but it would have been better to try to defend that than what happens in the game. So he played rook a c8, but there's a problem with this move, and it's that white can keep the bishop with bishop b3. And it's going to be really hard to attack white here. It's possible, but it's going to be time consuming, and turns out black doesn't have that time. So rook c7. With this move, black is defending the a7 pawn. Now, natural idea here is to want to play a5, a4, and disturb that bishop. But you can't play a move like queen b5 here, because white could actually just take the pawn on a7. It may look dangerous to open the a file, but because the bishop on b3 covers a2, black is never going to be able to crash through there. Okay. So that's why he played rook c7. And now h4. Now the queen goes to b5, making way for a5, a4. And now h5. Now as black and as white too, g4 for white would be way too time consuming. If g4, black would play a5 and then a4, and suddenly it's anybody's game. Okay, g4, it's too much time. So h5. White just wants to open the h file. When you're attacking on opposite sides, with these pawn storms trying to checkmate your opponent's king, the value of a pawn isn't very high. You just want to open that king up, right? So now rook fc8. Knight h5 would have actually probably been better, but he didn't play it because he was afraid of the consequences after just takes and then g4. And then the queen's going to come in on h6.
Could you not take back with knight instead of king?
If knight takes, it ends up being pretty similar. Queen h6. You have to play knight h5. But I think this might be a problem after maybe rook d5, and then take on h5.
What would you play? Knight f6. Well, after that, you play rook there.
You were saying knight takes after rook d5?
Yeah.
Well, there's no time because the queen's under attack.
Oh, okay,
There's also a,
Yeah, it's really problematic. For example, queen e2, rook h5, queen h5, and defending h7 is not possible. Yeah, and even if you avoid mate immediately, you still get mated, right? So Larson just ignored it and played rook fc8. But now the h file is open and it's getting dangerous. So g4. And now the knight has to move. A4 doesn't work because after taking on f6, white would be attacking the bishop, and more importantly, he'd be threatening mate on h8 after. So for example, a4 takes. Taking on c2 might look dangerous, but white can just take because rook h8 is checkmate, right? So knight h5, but rook takes h5. And this is a really common theme throughout the Dragon. If you're ever black and you play knight h5, you better be calculating rook takes h5. It's a very, very common idea. And if you're white, be aware of that too. And now g6. The f pawn's pinned and it's being attacked again. And at this point, black has little counterplay left. White's down the exchange, but the problem is black's bishop is not really playing, and his king is too weak. And then Larson resigned here because after bishop e7, queen h6 is mate. And if king g7, rook g1 is killer. All right, so this is a great example of what you don't want to do as black, okay? This is not how you want the game to go, okay? But let's look at a more fun game where black has some more fun. All right. So exactly the same moves, right? Bishop c4 and bishop d7. So bishop d7 is the modern main line here. Instead of taking on d4, black's going to try to get a rook to c8 really fast. All right, castles, rook c8. And black's making a threat here, by the way. It might not look like it, but through the knight on c6, that's like an X-ray attack, right? It's a very serious threat. So bishop b3. And by the way, say white tried to just attack with h4. Can someone show me how black wins? Knight b4, white would be okay. Bishop b3. White has time to save the bishop.
Knight D5. D5.
You mean knight takes d4?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, the notation isn't very clear. But yeah, that's correct. So the bishop on c4 is attacked, and you just took a piece. So queen takes is the only reasonable move. And now what?
On D5.
Let's see. If d5, let's see, does that work? I think white is forced to play bishop b3, but I think he'll be okay there. You move this knight? Where to?
G4.
Yeah, knight g4. Knight takes e4 might look tempting, but white can play queen takes. Yeah, knight g4 is the problem for white. And now if queen d3, keeping an eye on the bishop, now what?
Knight takes bishop, knight takes e3.
Yeah, knight takes e3, or if you want, you can do knight e5. Both are just winning, right? All right, so that threat means that white has no time to continue attacking. So he has to safeguard his bishop, use a tempo for that. Now knight e5, h4. And so in this game, black plays knight c4, which is okay, but it's risky. As we'll see later, the modern preference is for black to play h5 and stop that idea of white opening up the h file so easily. All right, but knight c4. And, this is really the problem with not playing h5 is white is able to play that. In this game, white didn't necessarily play the strongest. Now, king b1 was probably better for white. And just a little bit of patience, and then white can continue attacking. But white played this knight b3 move, trying to win a piece, as you'll see in a minute. So now rook e8. Rook e8's useful in the dragon so that when white plays bishop h6, you can play bishop h8 and save the bishop. That's a really common idea for saving your fianchetto bishop, right? Because with the rook on f8, it's harder to save that bishop. Now, it is even an idea in the dragon sometimes to give it the exchange that way by playing bishop h8 after bishop h6, letting white take on f8. But, rook e8 is just a really useful move. Yeah?
If black's bishop goes on A3, H3, and then white bishop takes, why doesn't, no, white bishop goes on H3, and then black bishop takes, why doesn't queen take that?
It would.
Yeah,
But that's
exactly.
As black, you don't want to take on, if white plays bishop h3, you don't take it.
Oh, okay.
Just by the way, a little tactic here. So white didn't play bishop h6 right away, you might see. Can someone tell me why? This is a common theme worth remembering, too.
Oh, why didn't black take from white bishop?
Oh, so I'm asking why white's last move was knight b3, so why not bishop h6?
Because the rook takes d4.
If rook d4, I think queen d4, and white,
Then you,
there's no discovery because of checkmate, so.
Oh. Rook takes c3.
No, rook takes
No?
c3, queen takes
And
it,
then you take the bishop.
and then rook takes.
Oh, rook takes it into the rook.
But I mean, it's good you consider that though. I mean, if you're playing a dragon as black, pretty much every single move you should think, can I take the knight yet?
Can I sack on it? C3.
Knight takes E4.
Mm-hmm. There we go. So now the problem is there's discovery on the knight on d4. So if white plays knight takes or f takes, you take on d4. Right? So this discovery makes it hard for white to do that. So knight b3. And white's playing a clever idea, by the way, as you'll see in a minute. So rook e8, trying to avoid bishop h6. But now e5. So white's being sneaky. So it may look like a free pawn, but if you take, what is white going to play?
He's going to take bishop.
Right now, your bishop is defended by the knight. That probably gives you a hint as to what white is playing.
Oh, he's going to play G5.
Yeah, g5. And now black loses a piece, right? But there's kind of a problem with white's plan is that he loses a lot of pawns in the process here. So black captured on g4, and then bishop takes. So white's won 2 pawns, by the way, and now threatens this rook on d1. So white defended the rook, but now bishop takes. So black's got 3 pawns for the piece. And this is a common idea in the dragon, by the way. You know, don't be afraid to give up a piece for a few pawns. A lot of times it can be worth it to help safeguard your king. And especially here, after bishop d4, and by the way, black plays an even more radical idea here in just taking. Now the reason black took is that otherwise it's going to be an unfavorable position because white will mess up your pawns. So black gave up the rook now. So now black is down a full rook. But also keep in mind black has 4 connected passed pawns. So this has its own value. And now h5. Now objectively, you know, white's doing okay. You know, if you look at it, computer will say white has maybe, you know, half a pawn, 3/4 of a pawn advantage. But trust me when I say that black is having the fun here. You know, it's a lot more fun pushing your pawns down your opponent's throat than the other way around. So white manages to go down to the endgame, but this endgame isn't even that good for white. Black just has this horde of pawns still. And I'm not going to deeply analyze the endgame. I'm just going to show you because it's kind of fun. And then how does black finish off?
King f2.
Yeah, the notation's there, I guess. But yeah, king f2. And yeah, g2 and then g1 is unstoppable, right? And white can stop it with playing rook g6, but that's not any good because of what?
Focus upon f4.
Well, if you play f3, it actually doesn't make a new threat because, you know, even if you play g2 after king takes, the rook guards the g1 square.
Because king can take rook.
Well, the king on h2 would guard the rook, right?
March the D pawn.
Yeah, you could just play d4. So the white rook can't both stop the d pawn and the g pawn. So yeah, white's dead.
Pokemon. Gotta catch them all.
Yeah, if you notice my caption there says touchdown. So one of my first dragon books was the book by Chris Ward there, and he gives this game in there, and at the end of it, after king f2, he says touchdown. So I think it's a good description there. All right. So I guess it's sort of proof that the dragon's not really refuted. You know, we have, you know, players at the highest level playing it these days. So I figured, you know, showing a couple Carlsen games is a good way to show that. So Magnus Carlsen, if you didn't know, is a current world chess champion, right? So here's some games where he plays it. Okay. So again, the exact same opening. And this time we see this h5 idea, which I think is the right way to go. Just stopping white from prying open the h-file so easily. And we'll see a game later where white can try to pry it open, you know, really forcefully with g4, but that's very risky, as we'll see. So castle, knight e5. So bishop g5 may look like a strange move. By the way, bishop h6 for white is always risky because you give black the option to wreck the queenside pawns. Right? If you play bishop h6, black can take and then take on c3 and wreck that queenside pawn structure. So bishop g5 may seem like a strange idea, but in many ways, white's keeping his options open and may even play in the center. So white may play rook he1, f4, and maybe go for e5 and play that way. So it's kind of switching gears, or at least possibly. It's a very flexible move. So now rook c5. So you may wonder why black's bothering to play this. Has to do with queen a5 looks nice, but then black can play, or white can play king b1, and now white's threatening bishop f6 and knight d5, and because of that queen hanging, white is going to wreck black's pawn structure here. So for example, b5, white can play actually knight d5 here, and then take on e7 with check, and then take back. So this is a common tactic in the Dragon too. If you're playing your queen to a5, you got to watch out for that knight d5 idea. So rook c5. Like I said, king b1 is almost always useful here. Now rook e8. And finally, by the way, Carlsen is playing Rajabov here. So white's trying to open the H file by force anyway. So now it's looking dangerous, but black can use that fifth rank or fourth rank, depending on whose perspective you're looking at, to help lessen white's attack here. So queen a5. So black's not only putting pressure on the queen side, but also adding more pressure to that bishop on g5 from the queen on a5. So f4. Now rook takes. Don't be afraid to give material back in these positions. Here the important thing is that black gets rid of the dark square bishop's competitor, so his bishop on g7 is always going to be without competition. Now white played e6, by the way, because queen takes g6 was the threat, since his bishop on b3 pins the f-pawn. And white decided to sacrifice. This was probably not the right idea, but in any case, black's position is pretty healthy here. And now bishop e6. So this, see it? So this is a nice move. So white was attacking f7, so bishop e6 just breaks the pin. It may look scary with white's pieces around the king, but the queen and bishop do a really good job of keeping it safe. And with the two passers, it's really hard to defend. And then, yeah, the game went on a few moves longer, but black's winning here. All right. Any questions on this one? All right. And then this one. Now this one says Imagine Dragons. I think it's a cute title. So this game was between Naroditsky and Nakamura in the U.S. Championship last year. This was the title Imagine Dragons came from chessgames.com. They always give these, horrific or great puns, depending on if you like them or not, for these chess games. So this is what their title was for this one. So this time we see Nakamura playing this early queen a5 move. Now this is kind of the more aggressive way of playing. The downside of playing an early queen a5 is that you commit yourself, and we'll see why. By the way, if you're wondering what happened this game, king b1, probably not the most accurate move here. If you want to look at this, rook he1 is probably the best move for white. King b1 may not be so useful here. kind of like a wasted move, basically. Um, so bishop g5, and black just takes on c3 here. Even in the end game, Nakamura is confident that he'll have enough compensation for the exchange, and black really does have a lot of compensation here. So even though there's no queens on the board, white has a problem. These queenside pawns are really static. It's hard to do anything with them, and it's also hard for white to make use of his pieces here. I mean, the bishop on b3, although it attacks f7, it's just not that useful. Knight on d7 is heading for b6 and then c4, so white has to act fast. So white's gotten rid of one of the pesky knights, but black still has one more remaining. Now white's trying to force open the center, because if white just sits back, it's going to be a long suffering game. You can play king d2, but then black could play like knight b2. And after knight c4, it's going to be really nice. For one thing, a3 is going to fall, since knight c4 is threatened too. Now he played rook takes, which may look strange. Why didn't white play bishop takes e5?
Cares about the pawn on c3.
You mean something like
Bishop takes, rook takes c3.
No, white has much better actually.
Oh. Bishop h6.
Yeah, bishop h6.
Oh goodness. Thanks for that.
So this is a common idea to look out for too. That dark square bishop doesn't just have to operate on one diagonal. All right. So that's why he played rook takes, but it turns out, black still has a really good game here. So it's starting to look scary for black, but the tactics work out in his favor. So first, knight e4, blocking the e-file, putting the bishop. Now knight takes. Now how should black continue here?
Black takes bishop on f6.
With pawn or knight?
Knight. Or, no, pawn.
So if you play pawn takes, the problem is knight d6 check, and then takes on c8.
Yeah.
If you take with a knight, white plays knight d6 check, and then takes.
Well, oh yeah. Pawn e6.
E6, then rook takes. Any other suggestions?
Is there a danger with bishop d6 or bishop d3?
Yep. The threat is actually pretty much checkmate, right? Rook c2, knight d2, so c3. Now rook c5. It looks like this move just threatens a knight, but it's even nastier than that. So white took, and then what was Nakamura's idea here? Do you think it was to take f6? By the way, just for the record, after knight takes f6, what would white play?
Remove the knight for nasty discovery.
I have like queen
Yeah, knight g8 works, and then the knight's under attack, and we can't, guard it by moving the king, so knight e4.
White move or black
Knight
move?
f6.
Yeah, knight f6, right? Followed by taking the knight. So just taking the bishop isn't really going to be good enough. Yeah, rook b5.
Oh.
The threat of rook b1 mate is unstoppable unless you sacrifice your rook. So now he just resigned, right? And, another problem with taking the knight, by the way, is now your knight doesn't have a whole lot of good squares either. So this is an example of what you should do. Okay, this was a nice game. But like I said, queen a5 is kind of risky. White's mistake was playing king b1 in the opening because it was a loss of time. You notice how later, if you go back to the opening, so white played king b2 later on, so king b1 was useless basically, right? If the king were on c1, he could have gone to b2 as well. So yeah, instead of king b1 in the opening there, something like rook he1 would have been more testing.
Was he just afraid, was he just afraid about his a2 pawn? Was he afraid that Naka was just piling up on that a file? Because that's the only reason I would see moving the king to b1, right? To try to help.
Well, yeah, king b1 is a really common idea in these dragon lines. I think he just mixed up ideas here, mixed up lines. I mean, king b1 is basically just an opening mistake.
Right.
But yeah, king b1 is useful a lot of times, and I can show that later. All right.
Queen a5 just seems like a typical knockup move. And
Yeah.
you see him play online. He'll play like e4, then queen h5. Like move 2. It's just, I don't know. He's just throwing his queens out there.
Yeah, people give Nakamura a lot of flack, but he knows his openings really well. I mean, he may play a bogus opening, but he'll study it for 20 hours and just rely on the fact that even if it's not that great, the fact that he knows all the ins and outs and you don't, makes a difference. All right, so here was a game between Kasparov, another great playing dragon at the highest level in a world championship match
Is this on?
against Anand. Yeah.
Yes.
So this was in 1995. Just random tidbit, by the way. They played this match at the top of the World Trade Centers at the time. Yeah. So a pretty cool match location as far as that goes. Okay, so let's see how Kasparov does.
Incidentally, this World Championship was kind of a proving ground for the Dragon, the Yugoslavia Tack. A lot of games featured it.
So we see a lot of the same stuff. Notice that white's been refraining from castling queenside. Not that it's any great, but it's possible. And now white plays knight takes c6. Now, we haven't looked at any games in this so far, but it's a move that you'll face a lot against weaker players who just don't know what to do with white. And this game is a great example of why it's not any good. Okay? So b takes. Now b takes is important not only because you control d5, but the c pawn will help be useful later as a battering ram against white's queenside. So bishop h6. So you'll see a lot of weaker players play this because they might have a brief introduction to the dragon. They'll be told you want to exchange off dark squared bishops. So if you go back to this position, white can't play bishop h6 because it loses a piece, right? Black just takes on d4. And so if you want to do that, it's very logical. That's why a lot of go ahead. Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah. So it's really logical for white to play this idea, but as you'll see, it's not very good. So c5. So now we're intending c4. That's pretty much a serious threat already. So white blocks it, but queen b6, threatening b2. So b3. Now bishop b6. So it looks like white's going to plug up the center, but white just doesn't have time. I mean, this game is just a great example of how energetic Kasparov was. So now takes. E takes. So it looks like white's doing okay, but now e5. Now, white should have here just probably castled kingside and accepted, a slightly worse position, And white's worse because the bishop on c4 is just awful, right? Has no scope. It's not really doing anything. But it would have been best. In the game, white took on e6. but this is very bad. Now d5. White play bishop b2. Now, why would bishop takes d5 be bad?
Because knight takes.
Yeah, I mean, knight takes is probably okay. Black does have several good moves here.
I mean, you want to pin the bishop against the queen, right?
So which rook?
Oh gosh, it's C, C, D, right? I'm not
So rook c d8 gives you more problems because
sure.
this comes with check.
Yeah.
Well, queen b4 may be okay, but white can trade queens. So if you're Kasparov, that's not going to cross your mind, right?
So rook f8.
Yeah, rook fd8, c4, and then black can take and play c4, and white can't castle either way. So it's not going to be pretty. So bishop e2, but now c4. He's not letting a non-castle anyway. c3. Unfortunately, white can't even castle queenside because black can just take twice, and that's not going to be fun to defend. So c3. But now we move the rook to the e file. So white's trying to get off of it. White could have taken on d5, but the result's still going to be the same. Black just moves the rook. Now, can anyone tell me how Kasparov finished here? It's pretty nice. Very nice. So white has a problem. Now, first of all, white can't take the knight. Yeah?
No,
Yeah, rook f6. And white's in serious trouble. King e1, rook e4, then check. And then how does black finish off now? Rook d6. I think he can take.
Well then, queen f1. Yeah.
Queen f1, yeah, rook or bishop takes.
Yeah, but king takes queen. Rook d4.
Yeah.
So how? Yeah, rook e2. The problem is queen e2, and then yeah, and there's no way to keep defending the queen, right?
So you resign.
Yeah, after knight e4, he resigned. Now other moves don't work out well either. If you play queen e1, how does black finish off here? Yeah.
Wait, knight. Oh yeah. Why can I not? Knight g3.
Knight g3, queen takes.
Knight takes on the black knight takes.
You want to take this one?
Yes.
Yeah, white probably takes or takes. Knight d6. Bishop takes.
It's on the back of
Queen F2.
What's that?
Queen F2.
Queen f2, queen takes. All right, so let's look at this. So white is threatening bishop takes e6. By the way, we already know that taking the knight's really not a threat because of rook f6.
Right.
So we don't have to worry about that. Queen e3.
You're not
Um,
thinking queen e3, then you play knight g3.
I think white can just take it though.
The knight g3 check. This is the advantage with e3,
Yeah, I mean black's probably better, but
but not it's like not.
But then from there, knight could move to.
It'd be better, but it's not.
so our rook on e6 is being threatened, and besides that, we also want to make a threat. Right now, knight on e4 has no squares to go to. So maybe we can move the rook and support a destination for that knight. Yeah, rook d6. Yeah, knight d2 is pretty much unstoppable. It would force white to give up the queen. Now, rook d1's not possible because of takes, and then the queen can't guard f2. And again, for the same reason, fe is still bad because of rook f6, right? Followed by taking on e4. No good. So yeah, Anand got slapped down for trying this knight c6 idea. All right, so this is another game from the same match where Kasparov again is playing the dragon. And Anand got a better game out of the opening this time, but he still fell for a trap. So this time he castles. He doesn't bother with this knight takes c6 stuff. And again, we see black stopping white from pushing h5. So knight e2. So this is kind of a modern idea. So white's trying to overprotect knight on c3 so that he can't play bishop h6. So for white's move now, he could play bishop h6 without having to worry about black taking and then sacking on c3, right? So white manages to exchange star-squared bishops, but one problem with this line is it's kind of slow, right? You're wasting a tempo in a position where you're trying to attack on opposite wings. So it's probably not going to give white more than equality, although white's definitely not worse. He managed to trade queens, so I'm sure at this point Anand was very pleased, playing Kasparov to get queens off the board. And now Kasparov sets a nice trap. He plays bishop e6. So this is ultimately it's still equal. White can pretty much play just about anything here and be fine. But the trap is if white takes on e7, what's black going to do? Yeah. The problem is this hanging rook on e1. So if you play knight d5, black can play bishop takes. So he played b4. So he's trying to force the rook off of c5, and coincidentally, Anand thinks he's going to win the exchange here. And now knight b6. So it looks good. But now he was surprised. Rook takes. King a3. And now what was the nasty surprise that Anand missed? Rook b3, then c takes b3. Rook c3, then king b4.
Rook c2.
Yep. Rook c2 is the dagger. The problem is if white takes back, then rook b3, and then king a2, and now we win the rook on e1. So non completely missed rook takes c2. pretty idea there.
And if king takes b4 in this continuation?
Then rook takes that one. Yep. All right. So now let's look at another Carlsen game. This time he's playing Karyakin, which if you kept up with chess events, that's his opponent in upcoming World Championship match, right? Right. Or Karjakin, as some people like to call him. So again, h4, h5. Now, I think this is pretty much a must. So if you're playing a dragon as black, you see h4, you should definitely play h5, right? So again, we see this rook c5 move. Now rook e8. Rook e8 avoids both bishop h6. And another advantage of rook e8, by the way, is that if you want to play queen a5 later, then knight d5 is never a problem since e7 is guarded, right? So rook e8 is very useful. And now Carlsen makes a pretty unique interpretation. The standard operation here normally would be to take on h6 and take on c3, but he prefers to first throw in this a5 move. So it's kind of interesting, right? He's not playing queen a5, he's not taking on c3, so this is a very interesting idea. It turns out this possibility of playing a4 is pretty annoying. So Karyakin just tried to push and stop it. And it looks strong, but it's not perfect either. So now queen b6. And now he tried to go forward with g4. Objectively, g4 was probably not a good idea. He probably should have put a knight on b5 or something like that, because g4 just doesn't work out very well. Now rook takes c3. So the problem is that we're forced to damage the pawn structure because queen c3 leaves the bishop hanging. So b takes. And now there's another common tactic black unleashes. It's definitely one worth remembering too. It's this knight takes f3 idea. So black's giving up the piece to forcefully open that long diagonal for the bishop. And now knight e4. So now black's going to be able to take on c3 with tempo. Now it's hard for white to really save this position. So if you play queen e3 and try to keep control of the bishop on h6, then knight c3 is still good. Right, king c1. Black can trade queens, take the rook, and then take g4. And again, we have a position where black has a bunch of pawns for a piece, so you're going to be having all the fun there. Now, at this point, if Karyakin wanted to, he could have forced a draw right away. He could have played bishop f7, and then queen g6. So stopping mate there is unstoppable, so black has to force perpetual. Right, queen e3, knight e2, knight c3. Really no way around it. Now we can't play king b1, of course, because of queen b6, and then mate on b2, right? So that was probably forced. But he tried to play for win with rook f1. Now Carlsen played d5, although it turns out that was a slight mistake. With the consultation of Stockfish, bishop takes g4 would have been really strong for black, apparently. It turns out the knight being supported on e2 by the bishop makes it really dangerous for white. Knight e2 is going to be really scary.
What about bishop? After
Bishop where?
bishop d2,
Bishop e2? Probably not going to be. I mean, I think rook f7 is forced, and now black will probably plays like d5, guard g6. Yeah, I'm not sure bishop e2. I mean, you really want to support that knight on e2 so you can play bishop c3 after to attack the king, right? Maybe something like this, right? Maybe something like this, right? But as it was, he played d5. It went into this kind of messy ending, but it's still kind of balanced. Black's down the exchange, but he has the extra pawn, and turns out it's enough. So they drew here after playing a bunch of other moves, but yeah. But anyway, so that's another interesting idea is instead of going for queen a5, rook fc8, attacking c3 like Kasparov did, you can do this a5 idea. So this is interesting too. And who knows, this might be Kasparov's recent analysis too, since they trained together, right? All right, now a game from Topalov, adding one last thing. Now, if you know anything about Topalov, he loves complicated games, so it's no surprise that he would also play the dragon. Normally he plays the Najdorf, but you know, dragon is definitely not out of his repertoire. So again, we see the same rook c5 idea, and this time we see white playing g4 immediately.
If I get back up, Topalov delayed playing h5 there. Was there a risk of white playing h5?
So I think before white's castled, well, I think the issue is that rook c8 made a threat, because if you play h5, then I think knight d4 wins, right?
Gotcha.
With the same tactics we looked at earlier.
Yeah.
And one move we haven't looked at is white just immediately playing g4, just trying to pry open the king side. But really, it's objectively not a very good idea. So black takes. Now f4. In the Carlsen game, we saw white try h5 in a similar position, but this time f4. Now it may seem like white's making headway, since white, if we move the bishop at f6, then white will take e7, and if we don't, white will take f6, play h5. It looks like he's making progress. So black to play, what should black do? Yeah, just take it.
It's thematic, Elon.
And now b5. Now we support that knight. So even though white's just up a clear exchange, the fact that white can't attack at all on the king side, and black's extra pawn makes it really hard for white. Why do I take the knight? I think if bishop takes, black would have probably played queen takes. I mean, it's possible, but this is a very unpleasant endgame for white. Black can play rook c8, rook c5. I mean, so h4 would be a weakness at endgame, but if you play h5, we have this g5 idea too. And the problem here for white is black's passed pawns, actually. It may seem strange to advance your pawns on the king side in the middle game like this, but surprisingly, white just has no way in. And I haven't talked with white, by the way, and it was premature, but he just resigned already. Basically there was no counterplay really for white here. Black has these two connected passers, two bishops. It's not very much fun. All right, so that was all the games that I had included in the study. Did you guys have any questions or want to look at any particular line?
Can you talk a little bit about if there are alternatives for white for the against the Yugoslav attack?
Okay, yeah. So I concentrated almost entirely on the Yugoslav because it's both common and critical, but white doesn't have to either. There's lots of anti-Sicilians white can play instead of the open Sicilian too, but we'll just keep it to the dragon. So instead of playing for the Yugoslav, white can also just play bishop b2, which is just called the classical, right? So this was what Natalie Karpov used to play as white. Now Karpov was the world champion before Kasparov and after Fischer, right? And if you know anything about him, he was a more positional player, so it makes sense that he wouldn't be playing the Yugoslav because it's such an aggressive line. So against this, we can just play typical dragon style. Whoops. Okay.
Oh,
You can play bishop g7, after castle, castle, bishop e3, knight c6. So you kind of play the same style. Now in terms of critical lines to know, now if white just does nothing, you can play your typical developing moves. You can play bishop d7, and maybe queen a5 or rook c8 and knight e5. You have a lot of the same ideas, really. Another idea is you can play a6 and try to play b5. You know, if you can play b5, b4, and move that knight, then e4 will be weakened. But one line you should know is f4. Now against f4, does anyone know what the correct reply from black is?
G5.
Where?
G5.
G5? I'm. You might have the notation mistaken. You mean G5?
Oh, no.
White can take it, right? If knight e4, then white can play knight takes. The problem with f4 is it leaves the bishop on e3 undefended.
oh,
Well, knight g4 would just white could just take, right? What's that?
Is that
This? No.
a?
Well,
Not that ideal.
it's relative, I guess. Knight where? G5?
no.
And knight d5, knight takes. Right?
Yeah, is it like the?
No, no. E5, probably knight b5.
Sleeping one. I don't know, I thought like bishop h6 so he doesn't push the pawn forward or something.
I think bishop h6, you would run into g4.
Oh, is it?
No, d5, e5.
B6,
Yeah, queen b6 is right.
Okay.
So you're threatening both b2, and you're actually threatening a tactic as well, involving the weakness of that knight on d4. So if white plays like rook b1, you can play knight takes e4. And then, yeah, if you take the knight back, then bishop takes. And I think there is a line here where actually black will give up the queen. I'm trying to remember. How does it go? Is it there? So I think it's.
I'm looking for Melvin. Melvin?
So after knight e4, white can play knight d5 here. And at this point, you can actually take on d4.
Thank you.
Then get 3 pieces for the queen.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, if you have a chance for this is fun, of course. But you don't have to do that either. You could just play queen d8.
And
Right?
better development.
Yeah. So that's one line. Now another line that you should know is the Rabinovich Attack, which Fischer played. So it's not castling, it's f4, castle, bishop e3, knight c6, and now g4. So the Rabinovich attack, the idea is just, attack on the king side immediately and not really waste time with castling. All right. But one of the problems with Rabinovich is that, well, you're neglecting development. So black can just play bishop d7. And now if a move like g5, by the way, it's nice to remember that you can just play knight h5. This may seem really counterintuitive, allowing white to just completely mess up your pawns, but one problem for white is that it closes the h-file, so you're not going to have that easy idea. And giving up your light squared bishop gives you problems since black has all these squares on the queen side that aren't defended. Yeah, so you can't even take the pawn right away either because the knight on d4 hangs, right? So that's one idea. If white plays g5, you can play knight h5. And if you play f5, like Fischer tried to do, black should remember this d5 break, all right? It's important to play that so that you can open up the center. It's the classic response. When you're being attacked on a flank, open up the center, right? If you guys haven't read The Art of Attack in chess, great book because it introduces that idea, right? And now, if white takes on d5, you can play knight b4, right? And you can try to recoup that pawn. So just going further, one idea possibly is knight b3. You could play rook c8, and if white plays a3, you could sack, and black gets a great deal of compensation there. All right, let's see. Is there anything else I should cover?
You can play the 11 fish.
Yeah, the 11 fish is a good example. So what white's trying to do is just play e5 really early. It turns out it's not really perfect. You can just play knight c6 here. And the point of this move is to guard against e5 early on. Bishop g7 is kind of playable, but after e5 it's just really, really complicated. I don't recommend it. So knight c6. Now if white wants to continue with the e5 strategy, he can take and play e5. And it may seem annoying because if you take e5, then white trades queens and your king is misplaced. But you can play knight d7. And this position may seem strange because you're not going to fianchetto your bishop, but it turns out it's okay. After bishop e3, you can play d5. And you may feel uncomfortable because you're not fianchettoing your bishop, but black's doing fine here. The fact that white's played f4 is actually kind of a problem for him. Right? You can just follow up with bishop e7, castles, knight f6. It's a good position for black. So that's why the 11 fish hasn't really ever taken off. Okay.
This is a random question from the first game. In
Sure.
the first game, you're talking about rook a c1, but like in a later game, you talk about Nakamura doing rook f c1 instead. Like, is there any benefit? Like, would there have been a benefit for black playing rook f c1 instead of rook a c1? Like,
You mean c8?
Oh, yeah, rook c8. Yeah, rook.
So you mean here? So he played rook f c8. You were wondering why not rook a c8?
No, I thought he played rook a c. Or am I mixing up the games? I thought there was one where he played rook a c8. You said it was.
Was it a Nakamura game and not the Fischer one?
No, I'm confused. I thought it was the first game he played rook a c8.
Well, he did play rook a c8 later, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, the bishop was threatening it. Never mind.
Yeah, he moved the rook because the bishop was attacking it, yeah.
Yeah.
But going back to here, I mean, rook a c8 would be a mistake, by the way. Does anyone see how white would play?
Bishop takes a7.
Well, if you take the pawn, black will just take your bishop. Oh, black's fine here. You give up a piece for 2 pawns.
And a bishop.
Yeah, more importantly, a bishop. Yeah.
Dark square bishop.
This is nice.
Yeah, knight d5 is a problem. So if queen d2, we have the intermezzo where you take on e7.
Ooh.
So that's not any good. And if you play queen d8 to guard e7, then black gets a critically weak d6 pawn with knight f6. Now, if he takes, it's just no good. Bishop a7, leaving the pawn. Black plays bishop takes, it doesn't work either. So yeah, you got to be careful about knight d5, making a discovery on these weak points and your queen. All right, that was all I had. And I'll try to make this public or available to you guys somehow so you can look at the games again,